A Time to Stir, Columbia 1968. Paul Cronin, editor. Nancy Bieberman, Barnard Undergraduate, Strike Coordinating Committee. Children of the New Age. We were an optimistic and righteous generation, many of us raised by parents who had survived World War II. My dad was an Army combat vet who fought in the South Pacific and trained GIs on the use of top-secret proximity fused weaponry. My four refugee grandparents fled persecution of the Russian shtetls, arrived in America penniless, and spoke Yiddish and Russian at home. They were hopeful yet wary, with one foot in the suitcase in case they had to go back. Despite their caution, I blossomed into a high school liberal activist in the sheltered suburbs of Philadelphia. From my father in television, I learned about the world. My dad, an engineer, built an early version of a TV. We were the first in the neighborhood to get one. From that box in the corner of our tiny living room, I found out about civil rights and the intimidation and murder of Southern Blacks for attempting to register to vote. I saw Sheriff Bull Connor unleash his dogs and fire hoses on young Blacks, many no older than me. By the time I was in high school, senior in the Vietnam War, this nation's first televised war, filled my home with images of napalm children and burning villages as people ran from American cluster bombs, their bodies charred black by my country's lethal chemical warfare. I watched generals on TV talk about the enemy in words that made no sense. I decided I wanted to go to college at Barnard, mainly because it was located in New York City, teeming with diversity I craved as a Philly teenager. By the time I arrived on campus, my new friends and I all knew of high school classmates who had returned from Vietnam in body bags. Learning about and organizing against the war was what I did with my time outside of classes. The early months of 1968 unfolded, the Tet Offensive, the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., followed by Black rebellion in cities across the country. Students and faculty at Columbia and elsewhere were talking about the war and civil rights. Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, had a strong presence on college campuses, and in today's parlance, became the thought leader of the anti-war movement, holding rallies and teach-ins. At Columbia, the SDS chapter published critiques of the university for its affiliation with the U.S. Defense Department contractors. SDS also paid attention to how the university related its largely African-American neighborhood. When it became known that Columbia was planning to build a private gym for its students in a public park that separated the university from Harlem, the anti-war and civil rights movements converged. On April 23, 1968, hundreds of students, including me, stormed into and occupied a university building. Within a matter of days, 4 more buildings were occupied and barricaded by hundreds of students. I was eventually charged with criminal trespass, spent a night in jail, and was released the following morning. Columbia later dropped all charges against its students, and my graduation ceremony a year later took place at virtually the same spot where I had been arrested. Life inside Columbia's occupied buildings was intense, intoxicating, and profoundly pre-feminist. We believed we were making history by shutting down the university, but even at a time I and many other women felt that our views were not being heard and that we were somehow being excluded from real decision-making meetings from leadership. Columbia Strike alums have come together on most decade anniversaries of the student rebellion to reflect on what happened and what it meant. On the anniversary of the first decade, my recollections were laced with anger, and I decided not to go. 10 years after that, in 1988, I was asked to speak on a panel of strike leaders. I was taken aback at the notion that I had been any kind of leader, but agreed to participate. In preparation for the panel, I reread Up Against the Ivy Wall, published in 1969 by a group of strike journalists who had reported daily on strike activities for the university newspaper. Rereading the book as history was a revelation. It makes no mention of the more than 700 students arrested. Almost 200 graduate and undergraduates from Barnard were women. Only once in the 300 pages is a woman mentioned by name, and she is the mother of one of the male strikers. Barnard students are only called girls or co-eds, never simply students. The book's appendix is a cast of characters listed by name, which includes 17 students, 7 administrators, 25 faculty, and 10 community leaders and city officials. Not one is a woman. When describing the events of the mass arrests up against the wall, Ivy Wall records one girl speaking from the floor who gave a tearful anger appeal for staying. It is only the use of the word tearful in the entire book. In a description of the communal cohesion inside the buildings, the authors write that the students formed and joined task forces to serve the needs of the other occupants. Some stood guard at points of contact with the outside. Some kept up communications via phone and walkie-talkie with friendly buildings, and others, mostly girls, managed food and housekeeping details. As the campus flooded with police in full riot gear, there is this observation. "It's beautiful," one girl sighed as she watched the students perched high on the barricade, screaming obscenities at the cops. Being expunged from the pages of our own history reflects our devaluation by our brothers and lovers in this movement for social change. We pre-feminists felt demeaned and angry that our contributions to the Columbia site were marginalized. We doubted ourselves, and too many people apparently doubted that women could be reliable witness to our own lives. In the years since, I and other women I know from those times have, in one way or another, fought for the right to have ideas, to be in possession of the facts, and to be acknowledged. In hindsight, I better understand how unsettled we felt, for after all, we grew up in egalitarian families that took our intellects as seriously as those of our brothers. I certainly believed that my engagement with the New Left was no different from any guy I knew. We all believed in the inseparability of ends and means, of participatory democracy, on integrating politics into our personal lives. And yet, as I look back on 1968, the sense of euphoria that was emblematic of the Columbia strike is tempered by uneasy feelings. As Todd Gitlin put it in his book, The 60s, movement men sought women out, recruited us, took us seriously and honored our intelligence, yet demoted us to girlfriends, wives, note-takers, and coffee makers. We cherish our personal relationships with guys, at least in part because without them, we could not have participated in the endless, informal, high-level meetings taking place. Yet quietly, we resented being there on male sufferance, or if our consciousness had not yet clarified those amorphous feelings into resentment, we were at the very least confused. The occupied buildings became our homes, and we lived with each other, cooked, ate, cleaned up, women were at the forefront of that effort, and talked politics into the wee hours. One couple inside the occupied Fairweather got married in a candlelit ceremony with hundreds of witnesses, as officiated by Columbia's Episcopalian chaplain, who, to the delight of everyone, declared them children of the new age. There were a few women who had the guts and vision to speak up back then, including the newlywed bride. I will never forget a sign hung over a typewriter occupied Fairweather Hall that read, "To all women, you are in a liberated area. You are urged to reject the traditional role of housekeeper, unless, of course, you feel this is a role that allows you for creative expression. And speak up, use your brains." I wrote in an article at the time about male ego trips, that I, like many others, were trying to create a new form of leadership, one that recognized us as women, yet also as political people with thoughts and actions which must be communicated. People speak of Columbia as a transforming event, a unique time when we bonded intensely with each other, some of us total strangers. We placed our lives and futures in each other's hands. We ate, we slept, we breathed, and loved our political activism. Everybody tries to find too much emotional motivation in our protests. I was quoted in 1968 by the New York Times as saying, trying to explain how seriously we took our political beliefs. We're not just alienated. Nearly 50 years after the Columbia strike, my husband and I flew from New York to Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City. Spending time in this tiny country that shaped me as a young adult, consumed me from high school through law school, and nourished my morality as a parent and professional was gut-wrenching. For the war, it took me 5 decades to learn, was vastly more destructive in the number of bombs dropped and the use of chemical and biological warfare than I, at age 18, knew at the time. We traveled the country for a month from the Mekong Delta to the Central Highlands, north to Hanoi, and mountain villages less than 10 miles from the China border. We swam in the Gulf of Tonkin and saw monuments at Can Tri and the ancient imperial city of Hue. which was leveled in 1968. We climbed through the Vinmock tunnels, which housed an entire rural community during the war, hundreds of families escaping the bombing, 30 meters below ground. Babies were born in the tunnel as doctors made use of an operating table fabricated from metal salvage from a downed American plane. The day I spent at the Vietnam Women's Museum in Hanoi when I flashed back to being a young woman at Columbia. The museum portrays women's lives throughout Vietnamese history as a tapestry of vital roles: mother, soldier, student, all with strong feminine qualities, all whole and essential. Vietnamese women seem to be guilelessly self-determined agents of their own destinies, never victims. While at the Women's Museum, I finally began to grieve about what our country had done to these women and to their families. Later, emerging from the claustrophobic Cu Chi tunnels near Ho Chi Minh City, in which the North Vietnamese soldiers lived and which they used as a base of operations, I started sobbing. Our guide embraced me and told me not to cry, saying that it was all in the past and the Vietnamese had moved on. Perhaps Buddhism, its loving kindness, compassion, sympathy, equanimity, encourages this thinking. Again and again, I repeated the words to myself as we visited tombs, battlefields, and museums that recalled the vivid details of the war. By the time we returned from Saigon to New York, President Obama had set out for Vietnam and Laos. While in Laos, he acknowledged that 270 million American bombs had been dropped on what was then a top-secret operation aimed at destroying supply routes along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. About a third of the bombs to hit Laos never exploded, and to this day, unexploded ordnance dropped by American bombers kills and maims hundreds of people every year. Most of my professional life has been based in the South Bronx, long a poster child for warlike destruction masquerading as urban renewal. In 1988, I began working to redevelop 23 abandoned, burned-out buildings, once home to more than 700 families. Across the facade of one building were the words, "Persistence of memory." That idea has animated my life and work. After all, things that are destroyed and buried can be forever forgotten. History and memory are fragile and easily manipulated or erased. My father never ceased talking about his wartime experiences. Even as his memory succumbed to Alzheimer's, he fought the just war, yet supported me as I fought against an unjust one. In the hazy weeks after he died in 2015, I visited Washington, D.C. and walked through the memorials. To the World War II veterans, to FDR, to the American soldiers killed in Vietnam. Standing at the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial, I recall the trip my husband and I had taken with two of our children, then 9 and 14, to see the death camps in Auschwitz, and also later the beaches of Normandy. We wanted them to learn to recognize evil in the world and to begin their own lifelong dialogues with themselves and about how a moral person acts in the face of immorality. Etched on the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial are these words from 1967. I oppose the war in Vietnam because I love America. I speak out against it, not in anger, but with anxiety and sorrow in my heart. And above all, with passionate desire to see our beloved country stand as a moral example to the world. We knew that as students, we could not stop the Vietnam War, nor could we end racism, but we could do our part, which at Columbia in 1968 was to broadcast as loudly as we could that students were willing to put their lives and futures at risk to end this awful war. What we learned during those 6 days of the building occupation was the transformative power of individuals working together in pursuit of justice. Ho Chi Minh once said that his people were never anti-American, only against the American government, and that the war would end when the American people stopped their government from pursuing it. Perhaps we Columbia protesters can take some credit in catalyzing the student movement in the United States against the war, which in turn helped catalyze the rest of the nation. Perhaps we saved some lives. We did the best we could. In hindsight, we should have done more. But we were, like all who were fighting, so young. There's a photo here on this page as well. It says, "Liberated women, remember your pill." Figure 1.1, graffiti on a blackboard inside occupied Fairweather Hall, photographed by Gerald Alder. Nancy Bieberman, 69, Barnard College, is president of WHED Co., a community development organization in the South Bronx that she founded in 1992. She pioneered a process of community-driven contextual development grounded in the preservation, memory, and history of the South Bronx by renovating old buildings or constructing new structures on vacant land to anchor and preserve neighborhoods. She began her career as a legal services lawyer representing tenants, immigrants, and women in abusive relationships. She is married and the mother of 3 grown children.